Waitress kiss millionaire in front of his family at a luxury restaurant. When he discovers why, he falls to his knees in tears. The Lexington was the epitome of luxury, a masterpiece of refined elegance in every sense. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a warm golden glow, their light dancing off polished marble floors and plush velvet chairs that exuded opulence. The air was thick with the rich aroma of aged wine and perfectly seared filet mignon, a signature of the restaurant's exclusivity. Every detail, immaculately folded napkins, silverware arranged with precise perfection, was a testament to Vince Sinclair's relentless pursuit of excellence. And at the very center of it all sat Vince himself, an imposing figure in a custom-tailored navy blue suit, his fingers wrapped around a glass of Bordeaux. He radiated confidence, the kind forged through years of ruthless ambition, of crushing competitors without hesitation. Tonight was a celebration. He had just secured a multi-million-dollar contract, a deal that would further cement his reign as the undisputed king of high-end dining. His family, his closest business associates, and a handful of hand-picked guests raised their glasses in unison, their smiles a blend of genuine joy and obligatory admiration. Among them, standing discreetly by the table, was Raven Kensington, a waitress who had only been working at the Lexington for a few months. To Vince, she was inconsequential, just another employee, easily replaceable. But that night, Raven was more than just a server. She was an observer, and she noticed something. Just before the toast, a flicker of movement caught her eye, a subtle yet deliberate switch as an unfamiliar waiter replaced Vince's glass with another identical one. At first, she questioned whether she had imagined it, but then she saw it, a barely perceptible shift in the wine's color, a faintly altered reflection in the ambient light. A cold chill ran down her spine, her pulse quickened. Something was wrong. She had only seconds to act. A scream would be too slow. By the time she explained, it would already be too late. Vince would have taken a sip. If her instincts were right, that sip could be fatal. With no time for second-guessing, Raven lunged forward. A deafening crash shattered the refined silence of the restaurant as she deliberately fell onto Vince's lap, sending the glass flying from his grasp. The deep red wine splashed across his pristine suit, staining it like fresh blood. A collective gasp swept through the dining hall, followed by a stunned silence. Then, chaos erupted. Whispers rippled across the room, some in shock, some in amusement. Businessmen exchanged puzzled glances. Vince's family stiffened, their expressions twisting from disbelief to outrage. His mother, an impeccably dressed woman draped in pearls, covered her mouth in horror. And Vince? He rose slowly, methodically wiping his hands, his piercing blue eyes locked onto Raven, who now lay sprawled at his feet, breathless. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was dangerously low, the kind of calm that promised a storm. Everyone knew Vince Sinclair was furious. Raven scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had no time for apologies, no time to soften the blow. He needed to listen. "Sinclair," she whispered urgently, leaning in so only he could hear. "I'm sorry, but I had to do it. Your wine was poisoned." Vince stilled. For a moment, his expression didn't change. It was as if the words hadn't registered. But then, something in him shifted. His body tensed, and behind his calculating gaze, a flicker of something darker, uncertainty, suspicion. "You're lying," he said, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. Raven shook her head. "I saw someone switch your glass. I don't know who they are, but..." "Who?" Vince cut her off, his voice now a dangerous whisper. Raven hesitated. She hadn't gotten a clear look at the waiter's face, but she remembered the stiffness in his movements, the way his uniform sat oddly on him, and, most telling of all, the way he had vanished the moment the switch was made. Before she could answer, a commotion erupted at the far end of the restaurant. Security had detained a man, the very same waiter she had noticed earlier. His uniform was slightly disheveled, his hands trembling at his sides. The second their eyes met, he bolted. Without hesitation, he shoved past the guards and sprinted toward the kitchen. Vince reacted instantly. "Get him!" he roared. His security team sprang into action, tearing through the dining hall in pursuit. The once sophisticated hum of elite conversation was replaced by gasps and hurried whispers. The Lexington, a sanctuary of refinement, had devolved into chaos. Some guests stood, craning their necks for a better look, while others, frozen in shock, remained seated, their gazes flickering between Vince and Raven. Vince turned back to her, his stare burning with 1,000 unspoken questions. But one thing was certain now. She wasn't lying. The wine had been poisoned. Someone had just tried to kill him. His pulse pounded in his ears as he studied her face. There was no guilt in her expression, only urgency. His instincts screamed that she was telling the truth. And yet, the sheer absurdity of it all made him hesitate. Poisoned wine, a last-second intervention that just happened to save his life? It felt too convenient, too surreal. He grabbed her wrist, yanking her a step closer. His voice, low and razor-sharp, cut through the tension. "If you're lying, you just made the worst mistake of your life." Raven flinched but didn't back down. "I'm not lying. If I hadn't done something, you'd be dead right now." Before he could respond, one of his security guards returned, breathless. The suspect escaped through the back entrance. "We have his face on camera, and we're already running it through our system." Vince exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He hated loose ends. He turned to his assistant, Renzo, who had been standing nearby, horrified but silent. "Find out who that waiter was. I want his full name, where he came from, and why the hell he was in my restaurant." Renzo nodded, fumbling for his phone as he stepped aside to make calls. Around them, staff hurried to clean up the mess. But the damage was done. The evening was ruined. Guests murmured in hushed voices, some already rising to leave. Vince's business partners exchanged uneasy glances, their polished smiles cracking under the weight of the spectacle. His mother, still seated at the table, let out a long, suffering sigh and pressed a delicate hand to her temple. "Vince, this is unacceptable. A scandal like this, at a time like this?" His patience snapped. "Not now, mother." She pursed her lips but didn't push further, knowing better than to argue when he was like this. Instead, she cast Raven a lingering look, her disapproval heavy in the air, before turning away. Vince's attention swung back to Raven. "You said you saw him switch my drink. Why didn't you just tell someone?" She clenched her fists. "I didn't have time. If I had run to security, you would have already taken a sip by the time they reacted." He hated that she was right. More than that, he hated that someone had come this close to killing him, and he hadn't seen it coming. A waiter approached cautiously, holding a tray with the fallen wine glass. The liquid had been collected into a small container, likely for testing. "Mr. Sinclair," the waiter said carefully, "should we send this for analysis?" Vince barely spared him a glance. "Do it, and make it fast." Renzo returned, his expression grim. "The waiter, whoever he was, doesn't exist in our employee records. He wasn't on the schedule. He shouldn't have even been here." Vince's hands curled into fists. Someone had infiltrated his restaurant, close enough to poison his drink, and he walked around unnoticed. The realization sent a ripple of unease through Vince. His entire world revolved around control, yet here, in his own establishment, someone had gotten close enough to kill him. He turned to Raven. "You've worked here for a few months, right?" She nodded. "Have you ever seen him before?" Raven hesitated, her brow furrowing. "No, but something about him felt off. The way he avoided eye contact, how he kept glancing at you. That's why I paid attention." Her words made his stomach tighten. How many times had he been in a room full of people, completely unaware of who was watching? Renzo's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then met Vince's gaze with an expression that made his jaw tighten. "We have a problem." Vince exhaled slowly, his patience already worn thin. "Of course we do." Renzo lowered his voice. "The security footage was wiped from our system right after the suspect fled. Someone on the inside erased it." A tense silence stretched between them. Vince had built his empire on control, on knowing everything that happened within his domain. And now, here, in his own restaurant, someone had outmaneuvered him. His gaze flickered back to Raven, her expression unreadable. She had risked everything, her job, her safety, to stop him from drinking that wine. "Why?" "I don't trust easily," he said at last, his voice measured. "But something tells me you're not the kind of person to be involved in this." He studied her, his sharp blue eyes assessing. "You work here, but you have no personal reason to care whether I live or die." Raven crossed her arms. "That's an interesting way to thank me." His lips twitched, something close to amusement flickering across his face, but it was gone in an instant. "I want to know why you did it," he said. "You could have ignored it. It wasn't your problem." She shifted, clearly uncomfortable. "Because I don't think anyone deserves to die that way." Her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something deeper. "And because I've seen people in power get taken down without even realizing it was coming." Vince paused. There was weight to those words, something personal. He made a mental note to revisit it later. Renzo spoke again, breaking the moment. "Vince, we need to decide what to do next. We can't let this slide." Vince already knew his next move. "Tell the head of security, increase surveillance on every restaurant I own. I want every single employee vetted again, no more gaps." Then, turning to Renzo, his voice sharpened. "Find out how the footage got wiped. Someone inside is working against me." His gaze flicked back to Raven, the only person who had acted when it mattered. "And as for you," he said, his tone softer but still commanding, "I want you to tell me everything you remember, every detail from the moment you noticed something was wrong." Raven hesitated for only a second before nodding. For the first time in years, Vince felt something foreign and unsettling. Vulnerability. Someone had come for him, and he hadn't seen it coming. But he wouldn't sit back and wait for the next attempt. He would find out who was behind this, and when he did, they would regret ever thinking they could take him down. The Lexington was eerily quiet now, the chaos of the evening lingering in the air. The once bustling restaurant had emptied, leaving only the scent of spilled wine and expensive cologne. Staff moved cautiously, whispering among themselves as they cleaned up the aftermath, their glances darting toward Vince when they thought he wasn't looking. No one dared speak to him unless absolutely necessary. The weight of what had happened still hung thick in the air, and Vince Sinclair had never been one to ignore a threat. Vince sat at a private table in a secluded section of the restaurant, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished wood. He watched as his security team worked, their movements precise, methodical. They had managed to track down the discarded uniform the suspect had used, left behind in a service corridor near the back exit. No name tag, no identifiers. Nothing to indicate where it had come from. Whoever this man was, he had walked in with a plan and vanished like smoke. The lab results on the wine had come back faster than expected. Enzo, his head of security, placed the printed report on the table in front of him. His expression was grim. "It was poisoned, sir." Vince picked up the report, his sharp gaze scanning the words. He didn't need a scientist to explain the bottom line. If he had taken even a sip of that wine, he would have been dead in minutes. "The compound is a synthetic neurotoxin," Enzo continued. "Odorless, tasteless, completely undetectable, unless specifically tested for. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Vince's jaw tightened. The poison would have shut down his nervous system, his organs collapsing one by one until he suffocated from within. A silent, efficient death. "So we're dealing with professionals." Enzo nodded. "Yes, sir. This wasn't an amateur attempt, it was calculated." Vince exhaled through his nose, his mind already running through the possibilities. He had enemies, many in fact. Competitors, former business partners, people who resented the way he operated. That wasn't new. But this wasn't about business. This was personal. Renzo entered the room, his expression dark as he checked his phone. "We've started an internal review of all employees. So far, nothing unusual. But I'm guessing whoever wiped the security footage covered their tracks." Vince's patience was running thin. If there's a mole, they're not making it easy to find them. He leaned forward, rubbing his temples briefly before shifting his gaze to Raven, who sat across from him. She hadn't left since the incident. Not because he suspected her, if anything, she was the only person who had actively stopped his death. But that didn't mean there weren't still too many unanswered questions. And Vince Sinclair didn't like uncertainties. Raven shifted under his gaze, clearly uneasy. She had been staring at the floor, letting the weight of the night sink in. But when she finally looked up, her voice was steady, though guarded. "What now?" Vince studied her carefully. She was still in her uniform, slightly disheveled from the chaos, but her eyes, though tired, remained sharp. "There's something about you," he said slowly, "something that doesn't fit the mold of a simple waitress." His voice was unreadable, but probing. "You tell me, how did you notice the switch when no one else did? That means you're either incredibly observant or you had a reason to be watching me that closely." Raven's jaw tightened. You think I had something to do with this? She scoffed, shaking her head. If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't still be sitting here. Vince didn't flinch, just watched her carefully. She exhaled, frustration flickering in her expression. I don't know what else to tell you. The guy just felt off. I noticed it, and the second I saw him switch your glass, I knew something was wrong. Vince leaned back in his chair, weighing her words. She wasn't lying. But that didn't mean she wasn't hiding something. Enzo cleared his throat. Sir, if I may, Miss Kensington's actions were reckless, but they saved your life. If she hadn't done what she did, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. Vince nodded slowly. I know. A moment of silence stretched between them before he spoke again. You sure you've never seen him before? Raven hesitated, and for the first time, something flickered behind her eyes. Something unreadable. No. Vince's fingers drummed against the table. He didn't like hesitations. But what? She swallowed hard. There was something familiar about him. Not his face, but the way he carried himself, the way he moved. Vince narrowed his eyes. Explain. Raven exhaled, choosing her words carefully. I don't know how to describe it. He walked like he was always aware of his surroundings, like he was trained for something more than just waiting tables. Renzo exchanged a look with Enzo. Military, possibly, Enzo murmured. Or at least someone with professional combat training. Vince didn't like where this was going. If the man who tried to kill him wasn't just some hired thug, but someone with real experience, that meant whoever ordered the hit wasn't just reckless, they were resourceful. His gaze snapped back to Raven. And you just happened to notice that? Raven's expression remained unreadable. I noticed things. Vince wasn't sure what to make of her yet, but he had a nagging feeling she wasn't just a simple waitress. There was more to her than met the eye, but for now, he had bigger problems. He stood, straightening his suit. Find out who hired that man, he ordered Enzo. If he was a professional, someone paid him. I want names. Renzo nodded. Understood. Vince turned back to Raven. And you? You're staying close. She frowned. What? He smirked, though there was no amusement in his eyes. You saved my life, which means you're now a loose end in whoever's plan this was. That makes you a target. Raven blinked, the weight of the situation settling in. So what? I just drop my life and stay by your side? Vince tilted his head slightly, considering her. No, you go back to work and act normal, but you don't go anywhere alone. Not until I know who did this and why. She stared at him as if debating whether to argue, but deep down she knew he was right. Someone had tried to assassinate him, and now she was part of the mess. She let out a sharp exhale. Fine, but I don't take orders from you. Vince chuckled low and dark. You will, if you want to stay alive. Raven rolled her eyes but said nothing as she stood up to leave. Vince watched her carefully. She was an enigma, and he intended to solve her. But first, he had a traitor to hunt down, and when he did, there would be no mercy. Vince had always been a man who controlled his world with precision. He had built his empire through ruthless efficiency, eliminating weakness wherever he found it. But tonight, as he sat in his office, overlooking the city skyline, an unfamiliar sensation crept in. Vulnerability. Someone had tried to kill him, in his own restaurant, right under his nose, and he hadn't seen it coming. He exhaled sharply, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. The burn as it slid down his throat did nothing to quiet the rage simmering beneath the surface. His fingers tightened around the glass as he replayed the night's events, again and again, searching for the exact moment when he had lost control. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Renzo stepped inside, his expression grim. "We have a lead," he said. Vince straightened, setting his glass down. "Go on." Renzo handed him a file. "The man who poisoned your drink. His name is Alex Mercer. Ex-military. Served in a specialized unit before being dishonorably discharged 5 years ago. Since then, he's been off the grid. No employment records, no fixed addresses. He's a ghost." Vince flipped through the file, absorbing every detail. Someone hired him. Someone with money and connections. Renzo nodded. "And that's not the worst part." He hesitated before continuing. "We traced a recent wire transfer to an offshore account linked to Mercer. The money came from a shell company." Vince's jaw clenched. "Whose company?" Renzo met his gaze, his voice cold. Lucien Sinclair. The name hit him like a punch. For years he had known his brother resented him. That was nothing new. Lucien had always been envious, always trying to outshine him, always pushing boundaries. But hiring someone to kill him? That was something else entirely. Vince threw the file onto his desk, his expression unreadable. "Where is he?" Renzo exhaled. "At his penthouse, acting like nothing happened." Of course he was. Lucien had always been good at pretending. Vince grabbed his coat and headed for the door. "Tell security to stand by. I want Mercer found." His voice dropped to something sharper, deadlier. "And I want to have a word with my dear brother." The drive to Lucien's residence was silent. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows as Vince's mind worked through the betrayal. Their relationship had never been one of brotherhood. It had always been a competition. Lucien spent his life trying to prove himself against his older brother, burning through money he didn't have, making deals he couldn't back up, expecting Vince to clean up his messes. But this was different. This time, he had crossed a line. When the car pulled up in front of Lucien's luxury building, Vince didn't wait for permission. He stepped out, his presence alone enough to make the security guards hesitate. No one dared to stop him. Vince found Lucien in his lavish living room, lounging on a leather couch with a drink in hand, smirking as if he hadn't just been caught orchestrating his own brother's murder. "Well, well," Lucien drawled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Vince didn't waste time on words. He crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed Lucien by the collar and slammed him against the wall. The glass tumbled from Lucien's grip, shattering on the polished floor. "What the hell, Vince?" Lucien gasped, struggling against the ironclad hold. Vince's voice was low, controlled, but brimming with fury. "You tried to have me killed," Lucien's smirk flickered. Just for a split second, before he forced it back into place. But this time, there was a nervous edge to it. "Now, I have no idea what you're talking about." Vince's grip tightened. "I have proof, Lucien. I know about Mercer. I know about the money you wired to him. You really thought you'd get away with it?" Lucien let out a breathless chuckle, though it sounded more forced than arrogant. "Vince, let's be rational. Why the hell would I want you dead?" Vince slammed him harder against the wall, his tone turning lethal. "Because you found out I was cutting you off. Because you can't stand the fact that you'll never be anything more than a second-rate leech?" Lucien's eyes darkened. "You think you're so much better than me, don't you?" Vince leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper sharp enough to cut. "I am better than you." For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick, electric. Then, Lucien's smirk returned, slower this time, venomous. "You're right," he said, his tone almost casual. "I did it." Vince didn't react, not outwardly, but something twisted inside him. Lucien continued, voice dripping with mockery. "Do you have any idea how long I've waited for this? Watching you sit on your damn throne, acting like you own the world while I get the scraps? I was supposed to be the one in charge, but Dad always favored you, didn't he?" Vince's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with something cold and final. "You brought this on yourself." Lucien chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe. But tell me something, big brother. What are you going to do about it?" Vince held his gaze for a long, measured beat. Then, without warning, he let go, shoving Lucien backward. "I could end this tonight, but that would be too easy." His expression darkened. "Instead, you just made the biggest mistake of your life." Lucien adjusted his collar, smirking despite the tension in his shoulders. "We'll see about that." Vince didn't respond. Lucien wasn't worth another second of his time. He turned and strode out, his mind already working through his next move. This wasn't over, not even close. As he stepped into the car, his phone buzzed. Renzo's voice came through the line. "It's Renzo, we found Mercer." Vince's grip tightened around his phone. "Where?" Renzo hesitated. "He's dead." Vince felt his pulse quicken. "Dead? What?" His voice was calm, but a storm brewed beneath the surface. "Someone got to him before we did?" This wasn't a loose end tied up. This was a message. Vince exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. Someone else was involved. Someone even bigger than Lucien. And now, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about survival. The city stretched out beneath him, a sea of flickering lights, oblivious to the war brewing in the shadows. He stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, whiskey in hand, the weight of the night pressing down like an iron fist. He had expected Lucien to deny everything, a pathetic attempt to weasel out of it. Instead, his brother had admitted to the attempted murder as if it were nothing more than a twisted game, a power move in a rivalry that had long since outgrown mere resentment. And now, Mercer was dead. Someone had cleaned up the mess before Vince could get to him, which meant there was another player in the game, someone who wanted to keep their involvement buried. Lucien was reckless, greedy, and dangerously bitter, but he wasn't this precise. No. Someone else was pulling the strings. Vince's fingers tightened around his glass. He had spent years building an empire where control was absolute, where every piece on the board moved because he allowed it. Now, someone had flipped the table. Unacceptable. Renzo's voice cut through his thoughts, steady but laced with tension. We got more details from Enzo. Mercer's body was found in an alley downtown, 2 bullets to the chest. Clean job. No ID, no phone, no wallet. Whoever did this didn't just want him dead, they wanted him erased. Vince's gaze sharpened. That means whoever hired him thought he was a liability. Renzo nodded. Exactly. Mercer was a loose end and someone tied it up before we could pull the thread. Vince took a slow sip of his drink, thinking. That also means there's someone else out there who knows the full extent of this plot. He set the glass down, his mind already shifting gears. Forensics find anything? Renzo exhaled. Nothing. No fingerprints, no security footage. Whoever did this was a professional. Vince wasn't surprised. A sloppy assassin wouldn't have lasted this long. Lucien's working with someone, he said, his voice cold. Find out who. Renzo hesitated. And what about Lucien? Vince's jaw tightened. My brother was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He knew I wouldn't let this go. His eyes darkened. For now, we watch him. He just admitted to trying to kill me and I let him walk away. That's going to eat at him. He took another measured sip of whiskey, his voice dropping to something lethal. He'll make a mistake. A knock at the door pulled both men's attention. Enzo stepped in, his expression unreadable. Sir, there's something you need to see. Vince and Renzo exchanged a glance before following him out of the penthouse. They rode the elevator down in silence, the distant hum of the city barely reaching them. When the doors slid open to the lobby, Enzo led them toward a side entrance, where one of Vince's security team members was waiting. The man gestured to a black envelope resting on a sleek silver tray. Vince's gut twisted. He didn't like surprises. Enzo handed him a pair of gloves. No prints on the envelope. We scanned it for explosives. Nothing. But something tells me you're going to want to read it. Vince took the envelope carefully, his fingers steady despite the storm brewing inside him. He slid out the crisp white card inside and read the words, written in elegant, deliberate handwriting. This isn't over. Stay out of matters you don't understand. No signature, no indication of who had sent it. Just a warning. Renzo peered over his shoulder, his expression darkening. So we're dealing with people who send dramatic threats now? Vince folded the card and slid it back into the envelope. His voice was cold. This wasn't for theatrics. This was a message. Enzo's voice was low. Whoever they are, they're watching. They had calculated every move. They had anticipated his reaction, erased Mercer, and now they were telling him to back off. But Vince Sinclair didn't back off. Crush the envelope, he ordered, and double the security at every restaurant, every property, every asset I own. If they're watching, let's give them something to see. Enzo nodded, already making calls. Renzo leaned in slightly. You think Lucien sent this? Vince shook his head. No. Lucien's a child. If he wanted to send a message, he'd do it with a tantrum, not with precision. Renzo exhaled slowly. Then, whoever sent this isn't just cleaning up Lucien's mess. They're controlling the game. Vince's lips pressed into a thin line. Not for long, they returned to the penthouse. But Vince couldn't shake the feeling that the walls had eyes. He had spent his life being the one in control, the one pulling the strings. Now, for the first time, someone else had moved before him, and that was something he wouldn't tolerate. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number? You're asking the wrong questions. Vince's grip tightened around the device. Trace this, he ordered. Renzo didn't hesitate. Already working on it, Vince poured another drink. But this time, it wasn't about calming himself. He was waiting for whoever was pulling the strings to make their next move. Because when they did, he'd be ready. And he wouldn't just play their game. He'd win. Vince had never been a man to act on impulse. Every move he made was calculated, precise, designed to keep him one step ahead of the competition. But this was different. Someone had made the first move against him. Someone had taken a shot and nearly succeeded. Now, the rules had changed. Renzo worked silently beside him, fingers flying across the keyboard as he tried to trace the number that had sent the cryptic message. Lines of code flickered across the screen, bouncing between proxies and scrambled locations. Whoever sent the text knew what they were doing, Renzo muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. No luck. They covered their tracks. Vince exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. Keep working on it. No one's untouchable. Enzo entered the office, his stance rigid. We've tightened security across all locations. No unusual activity so far, but we're keeping a close eye, he reported. Vince nodded, already thinking beyond the basics. His enemy wasn't some amateur who could be scared off by extra security. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about control. And someone had just challenged his control. His phone buzzed again, another unknown number, another message. You're wasting time, the enemy isn't where you're looking. Vince's grip tightened around the device. Renzo had already seen it. This guy's taunting us. I'm not interested in games, Vince said coldly. If someone wants to play with me, they lose. His gaze flicked to Enzo, the man who had access to Lucien's financials, the trail that had led them to Mercer. Enzo hesitated. His assistant, his financial team, sure. But Lucien's reckless. He's got people in his ear all the time. If someone nudged him toward hiring Mercer, it wouldn't have taken much. Vince's jaw tightened. He had been so focused on Lucien, so sure his brother had acted alone, that he hadn't considered another possibility. What if Lucien was nothing more than a pawn? He turned back to Renzo. Get me everything on Lucien's recent meetings, calls, interactions, especially anyone who's been pushing him in a certain direction. Renzo nodded, already working. A heavy silence settled over the room, pressing down on Vince's shoulders. Then, Enzo's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his expression hardened. We have a problem. Vince's patience snapped. What now? Enzo's voice was grim. One of our restaurant managers just disappeared. Vince stilled. Which one? The Lexington. Name's Roger Mills. He left after closing up, never made it home. His phone's off, his car's still in the parking garage. Vince's blood ran cold. The Lexington. The very place where someone had tried to kill him, and now one of his own people had vanished. Find him, Vince ordered. He was already moving. Enzo was a step ahead, making calls as he followed Vince and Renzo to the car. The drive to the restaurant was silent, thick with tension. Vince's mind was razor-sharp, working through the possibilities. This wasn't random. Whoever had taken Roger Mills had done it with purpose. This was a message, and Vince was getting real tired of people sending him messages. They pulled into the underground garage beneath the Lexington. The place was deserted, security lights flickering overhead, casting eerie shadows against the cold concrete. Vince stepped out first, scanning the area. Enzo's men were already moving, sweeping the space for any sign of Mills. Then, just as Enzo reached for his radio, Vince caught movement. A figure slumped against the wall near the stairwell. Mills! Vince was across the distance in seconds, kneeling beside the man. His clothes were wrinkled, his face bruised, but he was alive. Mills let out a pained groan, blinking up at him. "Mr. Sinclair?" he rasped. Vince's voice was calm but sharp as a knife. "Who did this?" Mills tried to sit up, wincing. I don't know. They grabbed me, said I needed to deliver a message." Vince's stomach tightened. "What message?" Mills swallowed hard. "Stay out of the way, or next time it won't be a warning." Renzo cursed under his breath. Enzo looked ready to punch a hole through the wall. Vince's expression didn't change. He had expected retaliation, but not like this. This wasn't just about taking him out anymore. This was psychological warfare. They wanted him to feel vulnerable. Big mistake. Vince straightened. "Take Mills to the hospital. I want security on him 24/7. Enzo nodded, already issuing orders. Vince turned to Renzo. His voice was cold, lethal. "Whoever's behind this just made a critical error." Renzo raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" Vince's gaze was ice. "They just told me exactly how afraid they are." He let the words settle, then continued, voice sharp as a blade. "Because only desperate people leave warnings. Only weak people try to intimidate their prey instead of eliminating it outright. And now that I know my enemy isn't as invincible as they want me to believe," a slow smirk ghosted across his lip, "I'm going to hunt them down, no matter what it takes." Vince had always believed control was everything, the foundation of his empire, the force that made his businesses untouchable. But now, someone was trying to rip that control from his hands, piece by piece. First, they had tried to kill him. Then they had eliminated Mercer before he could talk. Now they had gone after Roger Mills, a direct warning meant to shake him. But Vince Sinclair didn't shake. He calculated, as the car pulled up in front of his headquarters, he was already forming his next move. Whoever thought they could rattle him was about to learn just how wrong they were. Renzo and Enzo followed closely as he strode into the building, his mind running through every possibility. They stepped into the private elevator, the hum of machinery filling the silence. By the time the doors slid open to his office, Vince already knew what had to be done. The sharp scent of fresh coffee greeted him, but his attention immediately landed on Julia, his assistant, standing by his desk. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Vince's brow furrowed. Before she could continue, the answer walked into the room, Ren Davenport. The moment Vince laid eyes on him, the pieces clicked into place. Davenport had once been a business partner, before Vince started distancing himself. The man had always been ruthless, always looking for an angle. But he had never been stupid enough to cross Vince until now. Vince strode to his desk, taking his time as he settled into his chair. Then, with a controlled motion, he gestured toward the seat across from him. Ren Davenport smirked. "Vince, it's been a while." Vince didn't return the smile. His voice was smooth, cold. "You must be feeling confident walking in here like this." Davenport chuckled, unbuttoning his expensive suit jacket as he sat. "Oh, come on, no need for hostility. I just came to talk." Behind Vince, Renzo and Enzo took their places, silent but watchful. Vince leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "Go ahead, talk." Davenport exhaled, feigning disappointment. "You always were straight to the point." His smirk widened. "Fine, let's stop pretending." He leaned in slightly. "You've been asking the wrong questions, Vince." Vince's expression didn't change, but his instincts sharpened. Davenport's voice lowered, deliberate. "Lucien was never the real problem. He's just a spoiled brat who hates you. But he didn't come up with this on his own. He needed guidance, someone to give him the right push." Vince's patience thinned. "You, Davenport, you cut me out." Davenport shook his head, laughing softly. "Vince, you thought you could push me aside and keep all the power for yourself?" He leaned back. "That was a mistake." Vince exhaled slowly, his voice ice cold. "So you convinced my idiot brother to have me killed?" Davenport chuckled again, this time with undeniable arrogance. "Lucien didn't take much convincing," he admitted, his tone almost amused. "He already hated you. I just gave him the tools." Vince nodded, absorbing the confession. "And Mercer, you had him killed?" Davenport tilted his head, eyes gleaming with amusement. "Loose ends don't fit well in my plans, you understand?" Vince's fingers tapped lightly against the desk. He understood perfectly. This wasn't just a petty revenge scheme. Davenport had seen an opportunity. With Vince out of the picture, Lucien would have taken over. And Lucien? He was easy to manipulate. Vince exhaled sharply, his patience thinning. "And Roger Mills?" His voice was calm, but it carried weight. Davenport smiled, almost encouragingly, mocking. "You're a smart man, Vince. You know when the odds aren't in your favor." Vince chuckled, shaking his head. "You think I'm just going to back down?" Davenport's smirk faded slightly. "I think you're outnumbered." He leaned forward, voice dropping an octave. "You've been so busy building your empire that you forgot something important." His eyes darkened. "There are people who want to see you fall." Vince studied him, his expression unreadable, Then slowly he spoke. "And you came here because you think I'll negotiate?" Davenport's smirk returned, confident. "I came here to give you a choice." He spread his hands like a man offering a fair deal. "You step down, walk away, hand the company over to Lucien, retire somewhere and live a long, quiet life." His smile sharpened. "Predatory, or—" he let the word linger in the air. "You keep fighting, and one day you won't see it coming." The office was silent, tension thick enough to cut. Vince chuckled softly, shaking his head. "That's your offer?" Davenport shrugged. "You're a businessman. You know how to recognize a losing battle." Vince stood, straightening his suit. Slow, deliberate. Then, without breaking eye contact, he walked around the desk, stopping just inches from Davenport. "You think I'm afraid of you?" For a fraction of a second, Davenport's confidence flickered, but he recovered quickly. "I think you should be." Vince smiled. "Slow? Dangerous?" "No, Ren." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Lethal." "I think you should be afraid of me." Davenport's smirk finally faltered. Vince leaned in slightly. "A quiet promise. You just made your biggest mistake." Davenport exhaled, standing as well. He forced a smirk. "We'll see." Without another word, he turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Renzo and Enzo were already moving, but Vince held up a hand. "Let him go." Renzo frowned. "Vince, he just admitted—" "I know what he admitted." Vince's voice was steady, but his eyes burned cold. Lethal in Vince crossed his arms. "So what's the play?" Vince exhaled, gaze still fixed on the door Davenport had walked through. "Davenport isn't a real threat," he said, voice quiet but razor sharp. "He's just a man who thinks he's smarter than he is." Renzo raised a brow. "And Lucien?" Vince's jaw tightened. "He's just the idiot Davenport planned to use." He turned to Enzo. "I want eyes on Lucien. If Davenport was willing to walk into my office and talk, it means he's certain Lucien won't turn on him, which means Lucien doesn't even realize how deep he is." Enzo nodded. "And Davenport?" Vince's smirk returned. Sharp, unforgiving. Davenport made the mistake of showing his hand too early. His voice was calm, measured. "Now, I get to destroy him." Renzo exhaled. "You sure you don't want to take him out the easy way?" Vince chuckled. No, I want him to watch." He turned to the window, his gaze sweeping across the city. Davenport thought he had won. Thought he had Vince Sinclair didn't play by the rules. And by the time he was done, Davenport would regret ever thinking he could take the throne. Vince had played this game long enough to know when someone was bluffing. And Ren Davenport was bluffing. He believed he had backed Vince into a corner, leaving him no choice but to fold. But Vince Sinclair wasn't a man who folded. He was a man who destroyed. The crisp night air brushed against his face as he stepped onto the balcony of his penthouse, looking down at the city he had conquered. The skyline stretched before him, beautiful yet tainted. Somewhere in those streets, Davenport was celebrating. Lucien was probably too stupid to realize how deep he'd been played. And whoever else was involved, they were waiting, watching. Vince wasn't going to let them wait much longer. Renzo and Enzo stood behind him, their expressions tense but ready. They knew better than to interrupt his silence. He was thinking, calculating, planning his next move. Renzo was the first to speak. "So, what's the next step?" Vince took a slow breath, his voice precise. "We don't go after Davenport yet. He's expecting that." Enzo nodded. "You want to smoke out whoever else is involved?" "Exactly." Davenport was confident, which meant he thought he was protected, but that protection came from whoever was backing him. And that was the real target. Renzo crossed his arms. "And how do we do that?" Vince's smirk was slow, deliberate. "We make them come to us." The plan was set in motion by morning. A controlled leak spread through the right channels. A carefully placed rumor: Vince Sinclair was pulling out of a major expansion deal. The news hit the financial circuits fast. It was a strategic move, one designed to shake the people who had bet against him. If someone was waiting for his empire to weaken, this would make them think they were finally winning. By the afternoon, Vince had already received 3 separate inquiries from investors suddenly eager for meetings. Some were genuine, others were probing, trying to gauge whether he was truly on the decline. But the most interesting call came from Lucien. Vince answered on the 3rd ring, his tone cool. "Lucien." There was a hesitation on the other end. Then, Lucien's voice came through, forced casual, but Vince could hear the tension beneath it. "You're making some interesting business decisions." Vince leaned against his desk, eyes on the city below. "You've been keeping up with the market now?" "That's new," Lucien scoffed. "Come on, Vince, we don't have to pretend. I know what's going on." Vince let the silence stretch. He didn't fill in the gaps, and as expected, Lucien continued, trying to sound in control. "You're making moves because you know it's over. You can't fight this. You're done." Vince smirked. "There it is. You wanted to believe you'd won," he said smoothly. "But you're still looking for reassurance. That means you're not as sure as Davenport led you to believe." "Is that what they told you?" Lucien hesitated. "They didn't have to tell me anything. You think I don't see it? You've lost control." Vince chuckled softly, the sound cold, calculated. "If I'd lost control, Lucien," his voice dropped an octave, "I wouldn't still be here." A beat of silence. Then Lucien spoke again, this time with something almost like doubt in his voice. "You should take the deal, Vince. Step down. Walk away before it gets worse." There it was. The same script Davenport had fed Lucien, the exact same line he had tried to sell Vince. Which meant Lucien wasn't the mastermind, he was the messenger. The fool they sent in, hoping to make Vince concede. Vince let out a slow, deliberate breath. "Tell me something, Lucien." His voice was smooth, unshaken. "Do you actually believe you're in control? That Davenport gives a damn about you?" Lucien bristled. "I don't need him to. This isn't just about me. This is about all the people you screwed over." Vince's smirk widened. "Oh, I see. So now you're some kind of martyr." He let the words hang. "Doing this for the greater good?" Lucien's silence was telling. Vince continued, his voice dropping to something darker. "You don't even realize what's happening, do you?" He let the words settle, let the weight of them sink in. "They're using you, Lucien. They've been using you since the beginning. You think they're letting you win, but the second they don't need you anymore, you're gone." Lucien let out a nervous chuckle, but there was a crack in his confidence. "You always think you're the smartest guy in the room, don't you?" Vince's voice was calm, final, unshakable. "No, Lucien. I just know when I'm playing against idiots." Vince ended the call before Lucien could respond. Renzo let out a low whistle. "That went well." Vince exhaled, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Lucien's in deeper than I thought, but he's still unsure." Enzo leaned forward. "You think he'll break?" Vince's smirk returned, sharp and deadly. "Not yet, but soon." They had just finished debriefing when Julia entered the office, her expression uneasy. "Mr. Sinclair, there's someone here to see you." Vince raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Julia hesitated. She wouldn't give a name, just said it was urgent. Vince exchanged a glance with Renzo before nodding. "Send her in." A moment later, the door opened, and Raven Kensington stepped inside. It had been days since the night at the Lexington, since she had saved his life. But now, standing in his office, she looked different, more guarded, more aware of the storm swirling around her. She met his gaze, unwavering. "We need to talk." Vince gestured to the seat across from him. "Go ahead." She sat, inhaling slowly before speaking. "I think I know who erased the security footage at the Lexington." Vince stilled. His voice was steady, certain. It wasn't just someone covering tracks. It was someone inside. He leaned forward, intrigued. "And you know this how?" Raven exhaled. "Because I saw something that night. Something I didn't think much of at the time, but now it makes sense." Vince's pulse quickened. Raven met his gaze. "I think you have a mole." Silence stretched through the room before Vince finally spoke, his voice cold and controlled. "Then let's find out who they are." And just like that, the war turned in his favor. Vince studied Raven carefully, his mind already calculating a dozen different possibilities. She sat across from him, her posture tense but steady, her eyes unwavering. He had underestimated her. Once, she was just the waitress who had spilled wine on him. Now, she was proving to be far more valuable than he had anticipated. He leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the armrest. "Tell me everything." Raven inhaled slowly, choosing her words carefully. "That night at the Lexington, after I knocked over your wine, everything happened fast. Security was chasing the guy who poisoned your drink. People were panicking, but in the middle of all that, I noticed something strange." She met Vince's gaze. "There was a man near the security office. I barely glanced at him at first, but then I realized he wasn't panicked like everyone else. He was calm." Renzo, who had been listening in silence, frowned. "Describe him." Raven shook her head. "I didn't get a good look at his face. He was wearing a staff uniform, but I'd never seen him before. And here's what stuck with me. He walked into the security room, stayed for less than 2 minutes, and then left through the back. Right after that, your security footage was wiped." Vince exhaled slowly, his mind sharpening like a blade. Someone inside his own system had cleared the evidence. That meant the leak was closer than he'd assumed. Enzo straightened. "You sure he wasn't just a regular employee?" Raven's expression was firm. "No, no one was supposed to be in the security room except your team, and I know most of the staff at the Lexington. I've never seen him before." Vince exchanged a glance with Renzo, who was already scrolling through his phone. "I'll pull up the employee records from that night," Renzo said. "See if anyone was where they shouldn't be." Vince turned his attention back to Raven. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" She hesitated just for a moment. "Because I wasn't sure it mattered. I thought your people were handling it, but after what happened with Roger Mills, I realized someone's trying to clean up every loose end. If I noticed that guy, maybe he noticed me too." Vince's eyes narrowed. "You think you're a target?" Raven let out a humorless chuckle. "I don't know, but I do know I don't want to end up like Mills." Vince studied her for a long moment. She had no business being involved in this, but instead of running, she was here, helping him put the pieces together. His voice was calm, but firm. "From now on, you don't go anywhere alone," Enzo interjected. "I'll assign someone to keep an eye on her." Raven's eyes flickered with something close to annoyance. "I don't need a babysitter," Vince smirked. "That's not up for discussion." Before she could argue, Renzo let out a low curse. "Got something." He turned his phone toward Vince and Enzo, displaying a list of names. "These are the security logs from the Lexington the night of the poisoning. Every employee is accounted for except for one." Vince's gaze sharpened. "Who?" Renzo's expression was grim. "Seeker Foster. He was listed as part of the kitchen staff, but according to payroll, he was never actually scheduled that night. No one remembers hiring him." He glanced up, voice lowering. "And here's the kicker, he hasn't shown up for work since." A ghost employee. Classic setup. He was planted there and now he's gone. Raven's voice was quieter but firm. "Then that means someone else is still inside." Vincent's mind raced. Whoever orchestrated this had more than one piece on the board. Seeker Foster had been the one to wipe the footage, but he hadn't acted alone. Someone had gotten him in, given him access, and if that person was still around, they were watching his every move. His phone buzzed. A new text. "Unknown number. You're looking in the wrong places, but keep going. It's entertaining." Vince's grip tightened around the phone. His enemy wasn't just watching. They were enjoying this. Renzo leaned forward. "That's another warning." Vince exhaled slowly. "No, that's a challenge." For the first time in years, someone had forced Vince into reacting instead of controlling. And whoever was behind this, they were having fun with it. Enzo's voice cut through the tension. "We need to find Foster before he disappears completely." Vince nodded. "Do it, and start running background checks on every single staff member at the Lexington. If someone helped him get in, I want to know who." Renzo stood, already dialing numbers. Raven hesitated. "And what about me?" Vince turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You stay close. If someone's been watching, they might come after you next." She exhaled, then gave a small nod. "Fine. But if I get shot or kidnapped, I'm blaming you." Vince smirked. "Noted." The team moved into action. Vince walked to the window, staring out over the city. The war had officially shifted. They thought they had him on defense. They were wrong. Vince Sinclair had never played fair. And now he was about to show them why no one survived going against him. Vince didn't believe in luck, he believed in strategy. Leverage. The control luck was for the weak, for those who had no power over their own fate. Yet for the first time in years, he felt like he was the one being hunted. That wasn't something he was willing to tolerate. Seeker Foster? A ghost employee. A man who shouldn't have been there but had been given access anyway. Meant someone inside his world had let him in. Someone who thought they were untouchable, he was about to prove them wrong. Renzo had been on the phone for over an hour, working contacts, digging through every possible lead to track down Foster. Enzo had his team scrubbing security feeds across the city, but so far, nothing. Foster had vanished, and that wasn't an accident. Raven sat across from Vince in the office, arms crossed, watching the storm gather behind his eyes. "You pissed?" she observed. Vince glanced at her, arching an eyebrow. "You have a talent for stating the obvious." She shrugged. "Maybe, but you're used to having all the answers. This isn't something you can just fix by throwing money at it, is it?" Vince smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Everything has a price. Everyone has a weakness." He leaned forward. "And I'll find his before he could finish, Renzo let out a low curse from across the room. "Got something." Vince and Raven were on their feet in seconds. Renzo turned his laptop toward them, the screen displaying a series of transactions. "Foster's name is nowhere in the system, which means he was paid under the table, but I traced an unusual payroll movement at the Lexington. A payment to an unregistered contractor, made a week before the poisoning attempt." Vince's eyes narrowed. Renzo hesitated. "You're not going to like it." Vince's patience was paper thin. "Say the name." Renzo exhaled. "Shadow Reed?" "You're head of security at the Lexington." Silence. A sharp curse from Enzo. "That bastard was under our noses the whole damn time." Vince clenched his jaw, processing the betrayal. Shadow Reed had been his guy. Hand-picked. Trusted. A man who was supposed to protect his interests. Instead, he'd been working against him. Where is he now? Raven was the first to break the silence. Renzo shook his head. "That's the problem. He hasn't been seen since this morning. No calls, no financial activity. It's like he disappeared." Vince ran a hand through his hair, forcing himself to think. This wasn't just about money anymore. Reed had been the gatekeeper, the one who let Foster in, but now someone had decided he was no longer useful. Vince turned to Enzo. "Find him. I don't care what it takes." Enzo nodded, already moving. "On it." Then, Vince's phone buzzed. Unknown number, a new message. "Too slow, Vince. He's already gone." Vince's grip tightened around the phone. Someone was watching, tracking his every move. Always one step ahead, but not for long. He exhaled slowly, his voice cold and measured. "Get the car ready." Renzo frowned. "Where are we going?" Vince's smirk was sharp, lethal. "If Reed's still alive, he'll go to the only place where he feels safe." He met Renzo's gaze. "And I know exactly where that is." The drive was quiet, tension thick in the air. Raven sat beside him in the back seat, her fingers tapping against her knee in an unconscious rhythm. Finally, she broke the silence. "You haven't told me why you're bringing me along." Vince didn't look at her. "Because you saw something I didn't." His tone was matter-of-fact. "And right now, I can't afford to overlook anything." She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Fair enough." They pulled up outside a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where people went to disappear. Dimly lit, unremarkable, forgettable. Vince stepped out first, scanning the area. Enzo had 2 men stationed outside, already on alert. Renzo checked his phone. "Reed's car is in the lot. He's here." Vince walked toward the door, his movements calm, controlled. He knocked twice. No answer. Then a sound from inside. A chair scraping, someone moving. Vince exchanged a glance with Enzo. Then, without hesitation, he stepped back and kicked the door open. The apartment was dark, the air thick with the scent of cheap whiskey and desperation. Shadow Reed sat in the middle of the room, a gun in his hand. Bloodshot eyes. Shaking hands, he looked at Vince with something between fear and resignation. Vince didn't flinch. "Put the gun down." Reed let out a bitter laugh. "What's the point? You already know, don't you?" Vince took a slow step forward. "I know you let Foster in. His voice was smooth, sharp. "I know you took money to make sure I didn't see what was coming." Reed swallowed hard. "I didn't have a choice." Vince's voice dropped. "Lethal. You always have a choice." Reed's grip tightened on the gun. "Not when they own you." A heavy silence stretched between them. Then, Raven spoke, softer than Vince expected. "Who owns you?" Reed hesitated. Then, finally, his gaze flickered to Vince. "You think this is just about you?" His voice was hoarse, fractured. "You think this is just Davenport?" His expression darkened. "You have no idea who you're up against." Vince's patience was razor thin. His voice was ice. "Then enlighten me." Reed exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "You don't stop them, Vince. You don't fight them. You don't win against them." Vince's smirk was slow. "Dangerous." "That's where you're wrong." Reed let out a breathless, hollow laugh. "You're too late." His voice was barely above a whisper. "They already decided how this ends, and before anyone could stop him, he pulled the trigger." The gunshot ripped through the silence. For a second, no one moved. Reed slumped forward, dead before he hit the ground. Enzo cursed. Raven let out a shaky breath. Vince stared at the lifeless body, his expression unreadable. Renzo was the first to break the silence. "Now what?" Vince turned, walking toward the door. His voice was calm, steady, lethal. "Now, we make them regret ever thinking they could control me." The war had just turned. The stench of gunpowder still clung to the air. Shadow Reed sat motionless, slumped forward in his chair. A thin trail of smoke curled from the bullet wound in his temple. The gun dangled loosely from his fingers. His last act, a final, desperate escape from whatever hell he had been caught in. Vince didn't move. He had seen men die before, some by his hand, some by their own failures. But this was different. Reed had been a soldier in someone else's war, and when he realized there was no way out, he took the only escape he had left. A message, a warning, but Vince Sinclair didn't back down from warnings. Renzo let out a slow exhale. "Well, that's inconvenient." Enzo muttered a curse. "We needed him alive." Raven, standing a few feet away, arms crossed tightly over her chest, finally spoke. "He was scared." Vince turned to her, his voice even. "Fear makes men sloppy." She met his gaze. "Or it makes them realize they've already lost." Silence stretched between them. Then, Enzo stepped forward, nudging the gun away from Reed's fingers with his boot. "I'll have my team clean this up." Vince shook his head. "No, leave him." Renzo frowned. "You want to leave the body here?" Vince's expression remained unreadable. "Whoever he was afraid of, they'll come looking for him. I want them to find exactly what they left behind." "A ghost," Renzo exhaled. "All right, but this means we're back to square one." Vince turned to face Renzo, his smirk slow, sharp, calculated. "No," his voice was smooth, unwavering. "This means we just cut another one of their strings, because whoever was orchestrating this was running out of puppets." Enzo made a few calls, instructing his team to keep watch on the apartment while Vince walked back toward the car. Raven followed, her expression unreadable as they slid into the back seat. Finally, she spoke. "This doesn't end, does it?" Vince looked at her, studying her carefully. She wasn't scared, not in the way most people would be. She was aware, and that was even more dangerous. "No," he said simply. "It doesn't." She exhaled, turning to look out the window as the city lights blurred past. "Then what happens next?" Vince checked his phone. No new messages, no more taunts. Whoever was playing this game just lost a piece. And now they were waiting for his move. He tucked the phone away and leaned back into the seat. "We make them show their face." By the time they reached his penthouse, it was past midnight. The city outside was still alive, but in here there was only silence. Enzo and Renzo stayed behind to coordinate surveillance, leaving Vince alone with Raven. She followed him inside, but the moment the door shut, she turned to face him. "You still haven't answered my question." Vince arched an eyebrow. "Which one?" She stepped closer. "Why are you keeping me here?" His smirk tilted slightly. "Would you rather I let you walk out alone?" Raven scoffed. "You think I need protection?" Vince's smirk didn't fade. "I think you saw something you weren't supposed to." His voice dropped slightly. "And I think whoever's behind this knows that." Her jaw tightened. "So, that's it? I'm a liability?" Vince took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. "You're an inconvenience to them." His tone was low, deliberate. "Which means you're an advantage to me." She let out a humorless chuckle. "So, I'm just another chess piece?" Vince's expression remained calm, but there was something else in his eyes. Something darker. "No, Raven." His voice was quiet, assured. "You're the one thing they didn't account for." She studied him for a long moment before exhaling. "And what about you?" Her voice was softer now. "Are you ever afraid?" Vince's smirk was slow, knowing. "Fear is just another tool." His gaze locked onto hers. "You learn how to use it, or you let it destroy you." Raven's gaze didn't waver. "And which one are you doing right now?" Vince didn't answer. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting another taunt, another faceless threat. But what he saw made his blood run cold. A single photo of his mother, sitting at her usual table at a luxury restaurant across town, oblivious to the camera. And beneath it, a message. "You're not the only one with something to lose." For the first time since this war began, Vince felt true anger. Whoever they were, they had just crossed a line. Raven must have seen the shift in his expression because she stepped forward, eyes narrowing. "What is it?" Vince turned the phone toward her, letting her read the message. Her face paled slightly. "They're going after your family now." Vince's grip tightened around the phone. "No, they're trying to control me." But they had underestimated him. He wasn't the kind of man you threatened. He wasn't the kind of man you cornered. He was the kind of man who burned everything down until there was no one left to fight back. His voice dropped, quiet but lethal. "Get ready." Raven's voice was steady. "For what?" Vince's smirk was razor sharp. "For me to remind them why they should have killed me when they had the chance." The drive to the restaurant. The drive was fast. Silent Renzo was behind the wheel, his expression grim, his hands tight on the steering wheel. Enzo sat in the front seat, already checking security feeds. Raven sat next to Vince in the back, her gaze flicking between him and the city outside. She was waiting for him to explode, but Vince didn't explode. He calculated. Nova Sinclair wasn't a fool. She had built this family alongside his father, shaping it with power in ways no one ever acknowledged, but she was not a target. Renzo broke the silence. Whoever sent that message just made an unforgivable mistake. Enzo checked his phone, then turned slightly. She's still inside. No sign of anyone approaching her. Vince exhaled slowly. Then let's keep it that way. The restaurant. The moment the car stopped, two of Vince's security guards stepped forward, flanking the entrance. He pushed the door open and walked inside. Calm, controlled, but his presence demanded attention. The restaurant was full of the city's elite, men and women who thrived on wealth and power. Some turned toward him with curiosity, others with quiet fear. But Vince wasn't looking at them. His gaze went straight to the back of the room where his mother sat, an untouched glass of wine in front of her. She looked up as he approached, her sharp blue eyes scanning his face. "Vince," she greeted, voice even, "I wasn't expecting you." Vince pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Renzo and Enzo took positions nearby, watching the room. Raven lingered a few steps back, uncertain if she should be there. Vince didn't waste time. He placed his phone on the table, the photo facing Nova. "Who sent this?" She looked at it for a long moment before sighing, lifting her wine glass but not drinking. "So it's finally happening." Vince's jaw tightened. "You knew." Nova met his gaze, unwavering. "I knew someone would come for you eventually." She set the glass down. "You don't build what you've built without making enemies." Her voice was calm, but there was something else. Resignation? "I just didn't think they'd be this reckless." Vince leaned forward slightly. "Who do they answer to?" She let out a quiet chuckle. "If I knew that, I would have handled it myself." Vince clenched his fists. "You're leaving something out." Nova studied him for a moment before finally speaking. "Ren Davenport isn't your real enemy. He's a distraction. You already know that, but the people behind him?" Her expression darkened. They're older than him, more powerful than him, and they've been waiting for the right moment to move against you. Vince exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about something bigger, something older. Then, a single gunshot shattered the air. Glass exploded, people screamed. Vince moved on instinct. He grabbed Nova and shoved her to the ground. Renzo and Enzo were already pulling weapons, scanning the restaurant. Raven had hit the floor behind a table, eyes wide. The war had just begun. The warning shot. Vince's ears rang. The shot had come from outside. He turned his head, catching a glimpse of the shattered window where Nova had been sitting just seconds before. A warning shot. They could have killed her. They wanted him to know that. Enzo's voice was sharp, controlled. Shooter's already gone. Vince's pulse remained steady. His mind was already ahead. Slowly, he stood, helping Nova up. She was shaken, but not afraid. She had spent her life around men like this, men who thought fear was a currency they could trade. Vince turned to Renzo. "Lock this place down. Get her somewhere safe." Nova straightened her jacket. "Don't you dare put me in a safe house." Vince's gaze flickered toward her. "You don't get a say in this." She lifted her chin, eyes narrowing. "Don't treat me like some fragile thing you need to protect." Vince exhaled sharply. "They took a shot at you, Mother." She arched an eyebrow. "And they missed? Despite everything." Vince smirked. "Of course. You're not scared." Raven stepped forward, her posture cautious. "This wasn't just a warning, was it?" Vince shook his head. "No, this was an invitation." Renzo frowned. "An invitation to what?" Vince's smirk turned cold, sharp as a blade. "To the endgame." This was no longer about threats, no longer about warnings. Whoever was behind this had shown their hand, and now Vince was going to tear them apart, piece by piece. The drive, silence before the storm. Vince Sinclair had spent his life mastering control. Every deal, every move, every decision was calculated to maintain his dominance. But tonight, the rules had changed. Someone had crossed the line. Someone had threatened his mother. That wasn't just a mistake, that was an execution order. The ride was silent, suffocating with tension. Renzo drove like a man on a mission, weaving through the city at speeds that blurred the streetlights into golden streaks. Enzo sat in the passenger seat, fingers tapping against his knee, phone in his other hand, issuing orders to their security teams. Vince sat still, unmoving, unreadable. Raven stole a glance at him, arms crossed over her chest. She could feel the storm inside him. He didn't explode. His silence was more terrifying than rage. Finally, she spoke. "You're going to kill him, aren't you?" Vince didn't turn to her. His voice was calm. "Not yet," Raven scoffed. "So what, you're just going to scare him?" Vince's smirk was slow. "Dangerous." "No, Raven. I'm going to break him." Silence stretched between them. Renzo spoke from the front seat. "Davenport's got eyes everywhere. He'll know we're coming." Vince leaned back, exhaling slowly. Good. Because tonight, Davenport wasn't the one setting the trap. The club. No more pretenses. The car screeched to a halt outside an exclusive private club, one of Davenport's favorite places, where power brokers and corporate kings gathered behind closed doors, sipping whiskey as they whispered secrets, carving up the world like a meal. Vince stepped out first. The crisp night air did nothing to cool the fire burning in his veins. Renzo and Enzo flanked him, their eyes scanning the street. They weren't expecting an ambush. Davenport wasn't that sloppy, but he was arrogant, and arrogance made men reckless. The doormen hesitated when they saw Vince approaching, but they didn't dare stop him. No one stopped Vince Sinclair. Inside, the club was a sea of hushed conversations, the scent of expensive cigars and aged scotch thick in the air. Men in tailored suits sat in darkened booths, discussing deals worth billions. But when Vince walked in, the room shifted, conversations faltered. Eyes flickered toward him, some curious, others cautious. Few men looked away entirely, pretending they hadn't noticed him. But they all knew. Everyone in this world knew what had happened tonight. Davenport, a man running out of time. At the far end of the room, in a booth bathed in dim amber light, Ren Davenport was waiting, sipping a glass of Malin, his smirk lazy, forced confidence. He had been expecting this. Vince stopped in front of him, calm, controlled, commanding. Davenport set his glass down, his smirk widening. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Vince didn't bother sitting. He leaned forward slightly, voice low. "You sent someone after my mother." Davenport's smirk didn't waver, but Vince saw it. The slight twitch in his fingers, the subtle shift in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty. Davenport's voice was smooth. "I don't know what you're talking about." Vince tilted his head. "Lying to me isn't a good strategy." Davenport chuckled, shaking his head. "Let's be realistic. Do you really think I'd be stupid enough to go after your family?" Vince didn't blink. "Yes." For the briefest second, Davenport's smirk faltered. Vince took another step forward, his presence towering. "Let's get something straight." His voice dropped, razor sharp. "You don't touch my family. You don't send cowards with guns to deliver messages. If you have something to say, you say it to my face." Davenport's fingers curled around his glass. "I don't respond well to threats." Vince's smirk returned, slow, icy, dangerous. "That's funny." His gaze locked onto Davenport's. "Because neither do I." The game ends when Vince decides it does. Vince smiled. "Who said I was threatening you?" Before Davenport could react, Vince grabbed him by the collar and yanked him forward, slamming him against the table. The glass spilled. The club fell into absolute silence. Gasps rippled through the room, but no one moved. No one intervened. Davenport let out a strangled gasp, his hands gripping Vince's wrist. Vince leaned in, his voice lethal. "You think you can hide behind your friends in the dark? You think I don't know who's pulling your strings?" Davenport struggled, his bravado cracking. "This isn't..." Vince slammed him down again, rattling the table. "You made the wrong move." Panic flickered in Davenport's eyes. "You can't just..." Vince released him suddenly, letting him collapse back into the booth, gasping. Enzo and Renzo stood nearby, watching the room. No one dared move. Vince straightened his suit, adjusting his cuffs. "Consider this your only warning." Davenport wiped a shaking hand across his mouth, trying to recover. "You think you can intimidate me?" Vince's smirk was razor-sharp. "No, Ren. I think you're already terrified." Davenport swallowed hard. "This is going to come back on you." Vince exhaled, shaking his head. "No, Ren. This is going to come down on you." He leaned in slightly. "And when it does, no one will remember you." Silence. Then, Vince turned and walked away. The room held its collective breath. Renzo and Enzo followed him out, the weight of his presence lingering in the air like a warning no one would forget. The hunt begins. As soon as they stepped outside, Enzo let out a low whistle. "That was a hell of a message." Vince checked his watch, his expression unreadable. "Now we wait." Raven, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "Wait for what?" Vince's smirk returned. Cold. Lethal. For Davenport to start running, because now the hunt had truly begun. Vince Sinclair had spent his life hunting men like Ren Davenport, the kind that wore expensive suits, hid behind money and connections, mistook privilege for power. But power was only real when it couldn't be taken away. And tonight, Vince had started taking everything from him. Davenport wouldn't sleep tonight. He wouldn't sit in his comfortable office, sipping his overpriced scotch, believing himself untouchable. No, he would be waiting, watching his phone, suspecting something worse, and that was exactly what Vince wanted. The trap closes. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows of the car Renzo drove in silence. Enzo was still on his phone, coordinating security, tightening the noose around Davenport's businesses, assets, contacts, squeezing. It was only a matter of time before something cracked. Raven sat next to Vince, watching him carefully. She had seen him angry before, but this was different. Finally, she spoke. "So what now?" Vince didn't take his eyes off the city. "Now we let him feel the pressure." Raven frowned. "And then what? He fights back?" Vince smirked. "No, he makes a mistake. Because men like Davenport weren't built for war. They played their games behind desks, surrounded by lawyers and accountants who did their dirty work for them. But this wasn't a boardroom fight anymore. This was survival. Davenport runs. Renzo glanced at Vince through the rearview mirror. You think he'll run? Vince exhaled, tilting his head slightly. He'll try. Enzo finally put his phone down. We just got a hit on his movements after we left the club. He made a call, then another, and finally he smirked. Davenport is panicking. Vince's smirk widened. Good. Who's he calling? Enzo pulled up the records, some of his usual contacts. But here's where it gets interesting. He turned the screen. He made 2 calls to an unregistered burner number. We're tracing it now. Vince's fingers tapped against the armrest, mind racing. A burner phone meant only one thing. Davenport wasn't calling for favors, he was calling for help. Or for an escape route. The flight Renzo's phone buzzed. He checked the screen, then let out a quiet curse. We got him. He turned back. Davenport just booked a one-way flight out of the country. Private jet. Leaves in 3 hours. Silence then. Vince chuckled. So predictable. Enzo's expression hardened. You want us to stop him at the airport? Vince smirked. No, let him get on the plane. Raven blinked. What? Vince turned to her, voice calm, cold. You don't kill the animal while it's still in its cage. You let it think it's free. You let it run. And then, you bring it down where everyone can see. The final move. The next few hours moved like a carefully planned symphony. Every piece fell into place. Every move anticipated. Vince had Enzo's men watching every step Davenport took. Security footage from the airport was streamed directly to them. On the screen, Davenport's tense posture, his hurried steps. He was running. He thought he was getting away. Vince took a slow sip of whiskey, watching the screen from his penthouse. Raven stood nearby, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. You really think this is going to work? Vince smirked, setting his glass down. It already is. Checkmate. The fall of Davenport. Vince chuckled. It's already working. Because there was one thing men like Davenport never understood. Power wasn't about money. It wasn't about connections, it was about control. And right now, Vince controlled everything. Renzo leaned against the bar, checking his phone. Davenport just boarded the plane. He's taxiing now. Vince nodded. Good. Enzo's voice was calm. And here comes the fun part. A moment later, the screen flickered. Airport security footage switched to a live broadcast from a major news network. The anchor's voice was rapid, urgent. High-profile financial investor under investigation for fraud, money laundering, and illegal political bribery. Davenport's name flashed across the screen. His entire empire was being exposed in real time. The camera cut to a live shot of the airport runway. Federal agents were already moving. Then the plane stopped. Raven's breath caught. Oh my God, Renzo chuckled. And there it is! On the screen, the airport security team surrounded the aircraft. Minutes later, Ren Davenport was dragged off the plane in handcuffs. His face was pale, his body stiff with shock and rage. Vince exhaled, setting his drink down. Told you he'd make a mistake. The setup. Raven turned to him, eyes wide. You set him up, Vince smirked. No, Raven, he set himself up, because all it had taken was a few leaked documents, a nudge to the right authorities, and now Davenport was finished. Renzo laughed. Damn, that was clean. Enzo shook his head, impressed. Vince exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. Now we find out who was really behind him. Because Davenport was never the real threat. He had been just another pawn in a much bigger game. And whoever was still hiding in the shadows, they were next. The bigger game. Ren Davenport was finished. The world had watched as he was dragged off his private jet, handcuffed, his face plastered across every major news network. His empire, once built on arrogance and carefully cultivated alliances, was now crumbling in real time. Vince had orchestrated his downfall with precision. Because removing Davenport wasn't just about eliminating a rival. It was about forcing the real enemy out of the shadows. Davenport had never been in control. He had been propped up, funded, manipulated by someone far more powerful, and now that their pawn had fallen, they were exposed. The watchful silence. Vince sat in his penthouse office, fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair. The city below glittered with artificial light, but his mind focused on a much darker game, a bigger game. Renzo stood near the monitors scanning information. Enzo paced beside him, phone in hand, coordinating with their teams. Raven leaned against the bar, watching Vince closely. And in that silence, they all knew one thing. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The real game begins. "You don't look like a man who just won," Raven finally said. Vince smirked, his eyes still locked on the skyline. "That's because I haven't." She frowned. "Davenport is done. His businesses are frozen, his accounts are being investigated, and everyone he ever worked with is jumping ship." She tilted her head. "What else is left?" Vince exhaled, standing up. Davenport was a distraction. The real threat has been operating behind him, using him as a shield. And now, he smirked, now they have to make a move. The first lead. Enzo let out a breath. "And we're watching for it." Renzo looked up from his screen. "We've got something." Vince's expression sharpened. "Talk." Renzo tapped a few keys, pulling up financial records. "We've been tracking Davenport's last transactions before the arrest. Most of his accounts were frozen immediately, but one got through." Vince stepped forward, studying the data. Renzo continued. "A high-value transfer moved offshore. The receiving account is encrypted, but it was linked to a shell company, Vanguard Holdings." "The name that changes everything." Enzo's brows furrowed. "Vanguard?" He exhaled sharply. "That's not just any shell company." Vince's gaze darkened. "That's the kind of name that pops up when countries go to war, not when corporate idiots try to kill each other. Because Vanguard Holdings wasn't just a front, it was a power structure, a network that only the wealthiest and most dangerous people had access to. Governments, billionaires, arms dealers, and now, his enemies. This was always bigger. Raven stepped closer. "So, this is bigger than Davenport?" Vince chuckled, shaking his head. "Of course it is. Davenport had been loud and reckless, but the real enemy? They had stayed silent until now. The money never sits still." Renzo continued scrolling through data. "That transfer, it's on the move again. Whoever took Davenport's money isn't letting it sit still. They're trying to clean their hands before anyone can follow the trail." Vince's gaze darkened. "Where's it going?" Renzo exhaled, reading the screen. "Zurich." "The next move?" Vince's smirk widened. "Of course it is. Switzerland, one of the most secure financial havens in the world. A place where people with something to hide stash their wealth, their secrets, and their power." Enzo crossed his arms. "You think they're trying to disappear?" Vince's smirk turned razor sharp. "No, I think they're trying to clean up their mess before I find them. And they were too late." "Zurich, the final battlefield." Vince shook his head. "No, they're setting up for the next move. You don't run to Zurich unless you have a plan." Raven frowned. "So what do we do?" Vince grabbed his coat, buttoning it with slow precision. "We go to Zurich." Renzo blinked. "You want to fly into one of the most heavily protected banking capitals in the world just to chase this down?" Vince smirked. "No, Renzo. I want to end this." Enzo exhaled, already making calls. "I'll get the jet ready." Raven, however, was watching him carefully. "And what if it's a trap?" Vince turned to her, his voice dangerously calm. "Oh, it definitely is. That was the whole point. If his enemies wanted to set a trap, they had just made one fatal mistake. They thought he was the prey. They were about to find out he was the hunter. The flight to Zurich." The flight was silent, but not calm. It was the kind of silence that carried anticipation, tension, and inevitability. The private jet cut through the night sky, the hum of the engines the only sound at the head of the cabin. Vince sat, his mind working through the possibilities. Raven sat across from him, arms crossed. She hadn't questioned coming along, not after everything she had already seen. Renzo was on his laptop, finalizing their contacts in Zurich. "I pulled every thread I could, but whoever's behind this, they don't exist on paper. They don't leave trails." Vince smirked. "Everyone leaves a trail. You just have to know where to look." Enzo loaded his sidearm. "So we walk into one of the most secured financial districts on the planet, and then what?" Vince's voice was ice. "We make them show themselves." Because whoever had been orchestrating this war from the shadows had just forced Vince Sinclair to step onto their battlefield. But what they didn't realize, Vince Sinclair never stepped onto anyone else's battlefield. He burned it down and built his own. Arrival in Zurich. By the time they landed, the plan was already in motion. Zurich was cold, the air crisp as they stepped onto the tarmac. A black SUV was waiting, courtesy of an old contact with no loyalty but a lot of debts. Renzo checked his watch. The money landed 2 hours ago. They're here. Vince's smirk deepened. Then let the games begin, the city of secrets. Zurich was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that made people feel at ease. It was the kind of quiet built on wealth, power, and secrecy, the kind that kept wars from spilling into the open, where fortunes were made and erased with the press of a button. And now, it was Vince Sinclair's hunting ground, the final move. Vince Sinclair had never belonged in a city like this. He didn't hide his power in ledgers and private accounts, he wielded it. But tonight, Zurich belonged to him. The black SUV moved through the dimly lit streets, cutting through the heart of the financial district. Renzo was in the front, tapping on his tablet, tracking every digital movement in real time. Renzo sat beside him, his fingers twitching near the firearm holstered under his jacket. In the back, Vince sat still, watching the city pass by, his mind moving faster than the vehicle. Raven sat beside him, arms crossed. Her gaze flickered between him and the world outside. She wasn't used to this, not entirely, but she wasn't running either. Finally, she broke the silence. "Tell me, how does this end?" Vince didn't look at her. "With me walking away," he said. She studied him, reading between the words. Vince exhaled slowly, controlled. "They won't." Raven swallowed, but didn't say anything else. She understood now. The first real lead. Renzo cleared his throat. "We have movement." He turned the tablet so Vince could see the map. A money-hidden account registered to an office downtown small. Private no, visible ties to any major firms. He zoomed in. But here's the interesting part. It's owned by a shell company linked to Vanguard Holdings, and it just activated for the first time in 5 years. Vince smirked. "They're getting sloppy." Enzo exhaled. "So they're either waiting for us or running." Vince's voice was cold. "They don't get to run." The arrival. The SUV pulled up outside a modern glass building, the kind designed to blend in, to look harmless, but nothing in Zurich was harmless. Vince stepped out first, buttoning his coat as he walked toward the entrance. Renzo, Enzo, and Raven followed. Inside, a receptionist sat behind a sleek white desk. She looked up. Her polite expression faltered the moment her gaze met Vince's. She knew Vince didn't wait. "We have an appointment." Her hands hesitated over the keyboard. "With whom?" Vince's smirk didn't waver. "Tell your boss, I'm here to collect." A tense pause, then the woman nodded and pressed a discreet button under the desk. Within moments, a door at the end of the lobby clicked open, face to face. Vince led the way, his steps steady, controlled. The corridor was dimly lit, lined with floor-to-ceiling glass panels that revealed empty offices abandoned. Just before they reached the end of the hallway, a single figure waited. A man in a dark suit, perfectly tailored, silver hair slicked back, posture relaxed in a way that only men who never feared consequences could manage. Vince stopped a few feet away. "I was wondering when we'd finally meet," the man smiled. "Vince Sinclair, you've been very persistent." Vince's smirk never wavered. "It's a bad habit," the man exhaled, stepping forward. "Call me Harrison." And just like that, the real war began. The real war begins. Renzo muttered under his breath, "Harrison Kessler, a financial ghost, a man who existed only in whispers and transactions that never left a paper trail." Vince wasn't impressed. Harrison studied him. "You should be celebrating. You won. Davenport is finished." Vince's smirk never wavered. "Davenport was never the target," Harrison chuckled. "Of course not. You're a man who sees the board, not just the pieces." He clasped his hands behind his back. "But that's what makes you so dangerous." Vince tilted his head slightly. "You sound concerned," Harrison sighed, shaking his head. "No, Mr. Sinclair, I'm disappointed." Raven frowned as Harrison met Vince's gaze. You? Vince arched an eyebrow. Is that so? Harrison exhaled, stepping closer. You have all the makings of a man who could have ruled this world properly. You understand power, strategy, loyalty. You could have joined us. The mistake of underestimation. Vince's smirk faded slightly. You tried to kill me. Harrison's smile turned thin. Calculated? If I had tried to kill you, Mr. Sinclair, you wouldn't be standing here. Silence. Thick. Heavy. Vince exhaled. You backed the wrong man. Harrison nodded. Perhaps, but Davenport was never meant to win. Renzo tensed. He's stalling. Vince's pulse remained steady. Then, as if on cue, the building shook. A low rumble, followed by a distant explosion. Enzo cursed. That was the damn parking garage. Harrison smirked. Insurance, Mr. Sinclair. I can't have you walking out of here easily. Vince exhaled slowly. You really think this changes anything? Harrison tilted his head. Not at all, but it's a reminder. Even men like you can't control everything. Control is an illusion, unless you're Vince Sinclair. Vince took a step forward, his voice low. Watch me. And then, he moved faster than Harrison expected, a single punch to the throat, cutting off whatever smug remark was about to follow. Harrison stumbled back, choking. Vince grabbed him by the collar, slammed him against the glass wall. The entire panel cracked under the force. Harrison gasped for air, his confident mask finally slipping. Vince leaned in, his voice a whisper of cold certainty. Tell me, Harrison, when was the last time someone scared you? The older man's fingers clawed at Vince's wrist. But Vince didn't let go. I don't need to control everything, he murmured. Just you. The shot that changed everything. And then, a gunshot, not from Enzo, not from Renzo. Raven, she had pulled the trigger without hesitation. The security guard behind them crumpled to the floor. A dull thud. A body. A bullet. Vince smirked. Good aim, Raven exhaled. I wasn't going to wait for him to shoot me first. Vince turned back to Harrison, who was finally regaining his breath. Now, Vince murmured, let's talk about how this ends. Because Zurich wasn't the end game. It was just the beginning. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. And hey, there's another video just popping up on your screen right now. Click it to keep following heartwarming stories that will touch your soul. Stay tuned for more.